Kenmure Castle, on its high mound overlooking the Glen Kens and the wetlands of Loch Ken, makes for stunning pictures. With such stark ruins, it's easy to imagine ghosts lurking in the dark passages inside. But the tale of how Kenmure Castle came to be so ruined goes a fair bit deeper than flights of fancy or romantic notions. In fact, the history of this ruin is tangled deeply with the threads of Scotland's bigger story. It's been on both the right and wrong side of that story and faced destruction a number of times along the way, while at times playing host to some of its biggest characters. So here I am once again at Kenmure Castle, and I'm going to take a much more in-depth look at the history of this fantastic place. There's records of a castle here on this mostly natural mound from the 1100s, but it's likely this point, with its commanding views of the Ken Valley, has been a place of strategic importance for much longer than that. For some time it was owned by the Baliol's, with Lady Devergilla inheriting it from her father, Alan of Galloway. John Baliol, Lady Devergilla's son and also much troubled King of Scotland, may even have been born here. It came into the hands of the Gordons of Lochinvar in 1297 during the turbulent years of the Wars of Independence. During those years, according to Robert Trotter in his Galloway Gossip, Robert the Bruce attempted to attack Kenmure, where English soldiers were billeted. Outnumbered, Robert's attack was unsuccessful, and he took to the trees of the forests that covered the hills for miles around and leapt from tree to tree while the English pursued him with hounds. He escaped successfully and may then have gone on to hide in a miller's barn at Palmadie village, if Dr. Trotter's account is to be believed. The Gordons of Lochinvar claimed a lineage and right here in Galloway going back to the reign of Malcolm Canmore and the story of the wild boar of Corrie. As they told it, their ancestor killed a huge and dangerous boar at Corrie that Malcolm Canmore had offered a reward of the lands and titles at Lochinvar for the head of. The ancestor took a nap after killing the beast and cutting out its tongue. Then Roderick of Mossroddick in Dalry stole it while he slept. Roderick took it to the king, and the king was all set toward Lochinvar to the thief when the Gordon ancestor appeared and produced the missing tongue from the head to prove that he had killed it. After observing that the Gordon ancestor must have gored Doon with his sword, the king gave the land, title and name Gordon to their ancestor then. Well, it's a nice story, but not really the truth of it. The Gordons, just like the Bruces, were Normans originally and were probably invited to Scotland by David I, who wanted to modernise Scotland with Norman reforms like there had been south of the border since the Norman conquest of England in 1066. They were originally granted land in Gordon in Aberdeenshire, from which they took their name. It's not quite clear now how they came to own Lochinvar, but it seems they didn't live there for very long before taking ownership of Kenmure. What is known is that Robert the Bruce gave Kenmure to the Douglases after the Wars of Independence. The earliest Gordon of Kenmure, Adam, switched sides from fighting alongside William Wallace to backing the Red Cummin and Baliol's claim to Scotland, and was not supportive of the outlaw king. Nonetheless, Kenmure quickly made its way back to them. Now, let's go and have a wee bit more of a look around the castle. Here we are in the castle courtyard. Now, you have to bear with me here, as in Scottish history there seems to be a distinct dearth of male names. You will hear several Williams, a number of Roberts, quite a few Johns, some Jameses, some Alexanders, and the odd Adam. The castle here predates the town of New Galloway by a long margin, with the small village that existed to support the castle being called Roddings, taken from the surrounding land presumably. New Galloway came into being in 1630 and was developed as a new town in the style of Newton Stewart and Castle Douglas later. It often seems like the Gordons got themselves entangled in the losing side of history more than a few times. John Gordon was a staunch ally of Mary Stuart, and he accompanied her on her flight from Scotland after the disastrous battle at Langside. She may have stayed here on that flight, but it's more likely that she stayed at other times. One wing of the castle was named after her, and a guitar that possibly belonged to her was found here. There were also portraits of her and her son James as a child here. Maybe the latter's portrait was kept as a plea to young James's regent, the Earl of Moray, after he burned down Kenmure as part punishment for John Gordon's support of Mary. But because that was certainly the full extent of John Gordon's punishment, he kept his lands, though the castle was largely destroyed and had to be rebuilt. Mary was far from the only royal visitor to Kenmure. Her grandfather James IV visited regularly on his way to Whithorn, where he made pilgrimage every year. That tradition goes back at least as far as St Margaret, who made regular pilgrimage to Whithorn too, although that was likely before Kenmure Castle was actually built. Being burned down as a punishment for supporting Mary was not the end of Kenmure's story by any means. In fact, it was extensively remodelled around this time. The Gordons having been left with their fortune, they were able to do this. In fact, they were able to do this again after the second time the castle was razed, this time by Oliver Cromwell, as part of his flying campaign of suppression in Scotland on his way from campaigning in Ireland. At this point, even though the Gordons were staunch Protestants, they were ready to back Charles II since he had signed the Covenant. Charles had become King of Scotland and was living at Holyrood Palace, which he extended and renovated during his time there. Charles signing the Covenant and gaining the backing of the Scottish nobility in Kirk was what had prompted Cromwell to return from his Irish campaign. Robert Gordon, the 4th Viscount Kenmure, had fought the battle against Cromwell. He commanded a regiment famous for the barrel of brandy they carried at the front when they were marching. It was nicknamed Kenmure's Dram. Maybe this was what Cromwell was thinking of when he decided to attack the castle on his way by. Robert Gordon fled and watched it burn down from nearby Lowren Hill, but then signed an agreement that allowed him to retain his title in spite of his support for Charles. When Charles II fled Scotland, Cromwell declared himself Lord Protector of Scotland and attempted to rule it alongside England. Robert Gordon obviously didn't feel overly bound by his agreement with Cromwell and found himself jailed in 1654 for continuing to support Charles in exile. He escaped from his cell in Edinburgh Castle through a window and became wanted dead or alive. Cromwell's regime stripped him of his lands and titles, which were returned to him at the Restoration. He lived out his life at Greenlaw, not Kenmure, as the castle would have been in an unlivable state by then, and he did not seem inclined to restore it. He died in 1663 without any children, so the title and land then passed to the next closest male heir in the family, Alexander Gordon of Penningham, who became the 5th Viscount Kenmure. Let's go have a wee bit more of an explore, eh? The castle was added to during this time, possibly after the fire set by Cromwell, creating what is called the South Range or southern wing of the castle. Alexander had some involvement alongside Alexander Gordon of Earlston in Covenanting, and at one point Graham of Claverhouse ordered him and his family to vacate Kenmure Castle so that troops could be billeted there. He was also a military man, and during the Glorious Revolution he commanded a regiment and fought at the Battle of Killiecrankie, but he did not see much of the fruits of his labour as he passed in August 1698. Alexander's son, William, proved to be a highly controversial figure, as did his wife, Mary. This controversy seems to be largely undeserved on Mary's part, as we shall see. They married in 1711 and had two boys, Robert and John. The young 6th Viscount of Kenmure rode off to join the first Jacobite rebellion in 1715 and never returned. With his father having fought on the side of William and Mary of Orange only 20 years earlier, blame was quickly attached to Mary Gordon, who many people said had turned his head with her Jacobite beliefs. But Alexander Trotter tells us in his East Galloway sketches that William had been fined for drinking to the health of James VII in Dumfries before he had married. We are told too that William's father had visited James VII in France, where he had been badly treated by the deposed king. So the fact that William then took the old pretender's side and was prepared to fight for him in the 1715 rebellion seems even more of a surprise. Perhaps father and son had always had some difficulty with each other that prompted such a strong response in William. Well, maybe that and the fact that he was promised the title of Marquess for joining the cause. William took part in and was captured at the Battle of Preston in November 1715. He was taken prisoner and convicted of treason. He was beheaded on the 4th of February 1716 at Tower Hill in London. The title of Viscount Kenmure was taken from the Gordon family, but the lands were so heavily in debt that the Crown took the unusual step of not removing these also. There is a record of William's body being received at Leith Docks, but from there the trail goes very quiet indeed. He was certainly not buried in the Kenmure Isle alongside the rest of the Gordon family, so we can perhaps presume that Mary brought his body back to Kenmure to bury it secretly. Many years later, when given the opportunity to meet then King George I, Mary demanded that he give William a posthumous pardon, which was not forthcoming. Still, the king was supposedly impressed by Mary's bearing and attitude. William's story would go on to inspire Robert Burns' poem, O Kenmure's On and Awa, when he visited Kenmure, but we'll get back to that. Let's go and have a wee bit more of a look around, eh? Mary Gordon had been a very devoted wife, but she was also a hard-headed businesswoman. Before her eldest son, Robert, had turned 18, Mary had completely turned around the finances of the Gordon estates, from ruination to surplus. When Robert inherited at 18, it should have been easy for him to continue to build the family name and fortune, but instead first Robert, and then his younger brother James would squander everything until Kenmure Castle became a ruin again, and much of the Gordon lands were sold off to cover the debts of the lavish lifestyles the brothers embarked on. Robert began building the stunning mansion that you can see at Greenlaw by Castle Douglas in the early 1740s, presumably as a replacement for Kenmure Castle, which was suffering from neglect. He died in 1743, before the completion of Greenlaw, and the estates were then passed to his younger brother John. The debts were really stacking up by this point, and John was forced to sell the land the Gordons had at Tongland, and to sell Greenlaw to William Gordon of Earlston. Perhaps it was done as part of a desire to live more lavishly, but at some point in the 1740s there was a plan to completely remodel Kenmure Castle, but this was abandoned. In 1745, John Gordon was asked to serve under Bonnie Prince Charlie in the 45 rebellion, but he declined to take part, presumably having learned from his father's tragic example. John, like his brother Robert, didn't seem to keep very great health, and he died at the age of 55, having taken a cruise to improve his health. He died in Liverpool on the 16th of June 1769, leaving Kenmure to his oldest son, William. William was a serving captain in the 1st Regiment of the Royal Scots, and he only outlived his father by 3 years, dying in Minorca in 1772. He was succeeded by his brother, John. John was briefly in military service, but his true joy in life seems to have been living lavishly beyond his means. When poor Mary Gordon, his grandmother, passed away at the grand old age of 90 in 1776, she had lived to see first ruin, then the great work of rebuilding the family finances, then the acts of her sons and grandsons destroying it all. You have to feel more than a bit of sympathy for her. John became an MP for the Stewartry, but after being elected by a margin of only 20 votes, he was disliked and even protested against, and only lasted 2 years in the position. Now, John's mother, Lady Frances, had returned to Paris after her husband's death and lived there in ignorance of what her son was doing to the family finances until her remittance, or allowance, was cut off. She returned to Kenmure, which was in fact on sale at the time, and with a bit of luck from an inheritance of hers and some judicious pruning of the family estates, she was able to return the family finances to an even keel and prevent the sale of Kenmure. Now, it was during the lifetime of this John Gordon that Robert Burns visited Kenmure and wrote Kenmure's Ona Nawa as a tribute to John's grandfather, William. It was Robert's best friend, John Syme, who later would be involved in the potential sale of Kenmure as a lawyer, that brought Robert to Kenmure Castle, where they stayed the night at the behest of the beheaded Viscount's grandson. Maybe he was inspired by the long history of the castle itself, because this was also where he wrote Scots Wha Hae. Just before the trip, Rabbie received a royalty cheque from his publisher. As a present to himself, he bought a brand new pair of top boots for the princely sum of £1.02. While visiting the castle, John Gordon suggested that they take a trip together on the loch in his barge, called the Glen Kens. The very elderly Minister of Kells accompanied them. Unfortunately, though, the barge got stuck in the mud and reeds, and the laird and John Syme leapt out of the boat and easily waded to the nearby shore. The minister, though, couldn't manage that, so Robert hoisted the old clergyman onto his back and waded to shore with him, ruining his newly purchased boots in the process. According to John, Robert spent the rest of the trip complaining about those ruined boots. John Gordon was granted the family title back in 1824. When he died without any surviving children, the title of the castle passed to his brother Adam's son, also called Adam. Another military man, he spent a lot of his life in the Navy and fought in a number of battles. Again, he died without an heir, so Kenmure finally passed to his sister Louisa, who continued the work in refurbishing the castle that John had begun in the 1840s and 1860s. So a wee more of a look around, eh? When Louisa Gordon died, the castle passed to her daughter, Louisa Maitland, who did not live here. As from this time, the castle was leased out to tenants, including an American tenant who did a little bit more extension work to it. Louisa Maitland Gordon passed the castle on to her son, James, whose son John sold it in 1935 when it became a hotel. Served by the train station at Mossdale, called New Galloway train station, it was a popular resort for some years. Now, you may look at this building now, with its empty windows and crumbling floors and blackened pebble dashing on its outer walls, and assume that the castle burned down for a third time to achieve this level of neglect. But in fact it did not. What it met with was a crew of demolition workers stripping the building for whatever assets it had left to give. Lead from the roof, copper piping from the interior, and the roof itself to save the building from being liable for taxes. After it had been ruined, the Gordon family bought it back. And so here it is, A ruined castle with 1,000 years of history, overlooking Loch Ken on the eastern edge of Galloway. The ruins now make for a favourite local walking spot, with an RSPB reserve surrounding it, covering the wetlands at the head of Loch Ken. To many locally, some of whom remember the days before the roof was removed, it is a sad sight and a sad fate to a building that played host to so many years of Galloway and Scottish history.